Welcome, welcome. Before I make a few acknowledgments and tell you a little bit about CFW, let's see who's in the room. How many people here are connected to some type of coalition? Okay, so that's about half the room. How many of you are connected to some type of community organization? Almost everybody. Okay, so this is going to be a very interactive discussion, so start thinking about your questions. Without further ado, let me acknowledge our partners on this event. I'm going to list them all, so hold your applause. At the end, we'll give them a big round of applause. So first is Chicago Public Library, the Gene Siskel Film Center, Chicago Women Take Action, the Women's March on Chicago, Grassroots Collaborative, Off the Sidelines, and Rebellious Women's Magazine. All of them have partnered with us in presenting tonight's event, Beyond the Bridge, from creating coalitions to creating change for women and girls. Let's thank them all. How many of you are familiar with the work of Chicago Foundation for Women? Most of you, okay. But I wanted to share a little bit about who we are and what we do for those who are not, and because even those of you who are in the loop may not be able to keep up with everything we're doing. Chicago Foundation for Women, we're primarily a grant-making organization. We give about $2 million in grants a year to organizations working on behalf of women and girls in the region in three big areas: economic security, freedom from violence, and access to health care and health services. In addition to that, we also provide a number of different kinds of capacity building supports for those organizations and for women leaders in those organizations. And that ranges with everything from coaching for organizations on how to do better fundraising to partnering with other foundations to provide a space for women of color in leadership in organizations. We also do a ton of events. I was telling the folks in the green room about all the different activities that we do over the course of the year. We like to be part of coalitions and partnerships too. We're a member of the Responsible Budget Coalition. We worked very closely with the organizations working on the Women's March in Chicago and Springfield. So we like to be in the mix. Let me see, what else am I forgetting about Chicago Foundation for? Oh, well, and that the reason that we exist is because we believe, and I think you're all here because you believe, that when you invest in women and you invest in girls, you get better communities, right? That you cannot get the communities you want without investing specifically in women and girls. It's not a competition. We want men to be on board with that because that benefits them too, as we know. But we know that without that specific investment, we cannot all thrive. So thank you so much for joining us in supporting that mission of ours. So our big fundraising event that we do every year is our annual luncheon, which will be October 19th. And our luncheon speakers will be Dolores Huerta and Alicia Garza. They are going to be talking about their experience in a range of social movements from local, national, international, et cetera, and so forth. They will be in dialogue with each other. And we'll be talking about how diverse communities can unite to advance all of the issues that we care about. So it's going to be quite an event, and I hope that you will join us there and tell your friends about it and sign up. And after this panel, we're even going to have a drawing where you can win 2 tickets to see a screening of the documentary film about Dolores at the Gene Siskel Film Center. So stay till the end so that you can get your tickets. I will also put in a plug. On our luncheon day, we have a free symposium in the morning as well, which I organize that part. And that'll feature a lot of local women activists. So it's a jam-packed day full of women talking across all kinds of communities on how to build women's power. So we really, really hope you will join us. So I wanted to say just a couple of things about why we wanted to do a program on coalition building. You might have noticed there's kind of a lot going on in the world these days, right? I mean, literally every time you turn around, whether it's in Chicago, in the state of Illinois, nationally, internationally, there's so much happening. It's so hard to keep up with what's happening. I never thought I would see a day where my state attorney general would sue my city in order to get a federal judge to come in and do what the federal government is supposed to do anyway, right? I mean, so we're like in some really interesting times, And I think part of what we're all seeing happening in these really interesting times is that hate is coming out in ways that many of us have not seen in our lifetimes. Hateful rhetoric, hate speech, hateful actions, dangerous actions, et cetera, and so forth. And if you're not being encouraged to hate, you're being encouraged to hate the people who hate. Am I right? You know, all of us are being encouraged to choose a side, pick your camp, right or wrong. And I think the women here who are going to be speaking to us tonight really represent some of the best minds in Chicago when it comes to breaking out of that kind of narrative. That they have recognized, they have not only talked this, they have walked this talk, that only by building alliances across many issues and across many communities can we actually get real change. You have to make friends with people you don't like. You have to learn how to respect people with different points of view. You have to learn how to make space for people to join you who may have felt uncomfortable joining you before. We're all going to have to get a lot better at this. So we thought these women tonight could help us all learn how. So thank you for being here. Now, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, and I guess the panel, everybody should probably come up on the stage now, right? So we'll let the panelists come on up. So I'm going to, thank you. Let me introduce Maya Dukmasova, who's a writer and a reporter for the Chicago Reader. And she joined the Reader in 2016. And with the Reader's small staff, she has a pretty big beat. She covers the criminal justice system and housing, as well as arts and culture. So I will turn it over to Maya and let her introduce this panel. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. We have 4 wonderful panelists today. Our first panelist is Tanya Watkins. And she is a mother and writer and Black womanist and community organizer, originally from Chicago's South Side. Tanya began as a leader with Southsiders Organized for Unity and Liberation, or SOUL, in 2010. And SOUL is a multi-issue, faith-based social justice organization that assists residents to build power on the South Side and in the South suburbs. Since being with the organization, Tanya has led a multitude of programs and direct actions to force criminal justice reform and police accountability in the city. And most notably, she headed up a series of strategic actions calling for the resignation of former Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez in 2015. You might remember the Buy Anita campaign. Currently, Tanya is the acting executive director of SOUL and co-executive director of the Black Roots Alliance. Next, we have Ceci Nyman. She's the executive director of Ever Thrive Illinois, which is a statewide public health organization committed to ensuring the health of women, children, and families throughout their lifespan. Before joining Ever Thrive Illinois, she served as an organizer and lobbyist and ultimately served as vice president for policy and strategic partnerships at Illinois Action for Children. During her 17-year tenure, she's directed state and federal legislative strategy for the organization and contributed to significant increases in state investments in early childhood education. Next, we have Ana Romero, and she's currently the director of the new initiatives at Chicago Workers Collaborative. For 30 years, Ana has worked for the advancement of women's human rights and against the structures that sustain women's subordination and gender violence. She's a native of Mexico City and has raised and worked with a wide gamut of indigenous, peasant labor, and feminist social justice organizations in Mexico, France, Spain, and the Philippines. In 2016, Ana joined the Mizamayani International Network to End Violence Against Women and Girls in South Africa. Her participation in the network has greatly enriched her intersectional approach to gender violence. In May of 2015, she had the privilege of being selected by the Novo Foundation as one of the 20 leaders chosen nationwide to join Novo's groundbreaking 10-year program, Move to End Violence. And last but not least, we've got Jennifer Arwadi. She's the co-executive director of Chicago-based Communities United, a racial justice organization which brings together young people and adult allies to advance social change and systems transformation. Their approach is centered on transformative civic engagement and leadership development, and the development of broad-based alliances and coalitions. Jenny has 16 years of organizing experience, during which time she's supported young people and adult allies in creating the nation's most comprehensive statewide school discipline reform, advancing strategies through an invest-divest framework to shift resources from police and schools and incarceration into school and community supports. Jenny is a graduate of Princeton University, serves as vice chair for the Edward H. Hazen Foundation, is a field advisor to Funders for Justice, and is a field representative on the board of advisors for the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing. Okay, and our first question tonight will be for Tanya. We'll have a question for each one of our panelists, and then we'll watch a few interesting clips from Alicia Garza and Dolores Huerta and discuss some more, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as well. So there's some note cards floating around, so be sure to write down your question, and I'll let you all know when to pass it along. Okay, so first question is for Tanya. What are some of the biggest challenges to organizing people who suffer from police violence for police accountability and reform? And I wonder if you find it necessary to do a lot of political education before people feel like they have the power to change these conditions.
So I think that one of what we often miss in community organizing is actually taking the time to help build folks' political analysis. I don't think that it is uniquely needed in directly impacted communities. But what is needed in directly impacted communities is developing folks' understanding that they are actually the experts. They don't need folks to come in and teach or validate their lived experience. We saw the Rodney King video. Millions of people watched it around the world, and 26 years later, we are still debating the humanity of Black folks, and that is severely problematic. So helping people tap into their own individual self-interest and understand that what they're experiencing is real and it's wrong, working with folks who are directly impacted. And it's hard for me to talk about it because I'm born and raised on the south side of Chicago. So having this conversation like I'm going into a community and bringing folks along, that is my community, right? These are my folks, our experiences are shared. So how do we work together to talk about what we want our communities to look like? How do we talk about criminal justice reform in a way where we are redefining public safety? We can't really look at the criminal justice system and understand all the nuances because it's fluid. It's constantly moving, it's constantly changing. Systems of oppression adjust itself so they can continue oppressing folks, right? We're finding new nuances of the law that keep killer cops from being convicted. So no matter how much you delve into the criminal justice system, there's another layer. I don't know if I can curse. My daughter's in the audience. There's another layer that you find is fucked up, right? So on top of the elected officials, right? On top of the FOP, right? On top of all the additional laws like Stand Your Ground and things that get police officers off for murder, there's all of this bureaucracy that at the end of the day doesn't mean anything, and you can't fight that. So when we have conversations about what we want to build in our communities and how do we work towards building that, it becomes a lot more compelling. I think that the most important piece in moving folks in directly impacted communities is acknowledging like the generational trauma that people have experienced over hundreds of years of disacknowledgement, disenfranchisement, oppression, and actual abuse that is tangible. What they have felt is a real thing. These systems exist, and they have the ability to live differently, that in our communities we actually deserve better, which engages folks and really compels them to fight for what they want. So I don't know if that made sense. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I just wondered if you would also talk about some of the concrete steps you take to get that political consciousness raising work started.
So I actually, with Communities United, with Jenny, we're in a collaboration called the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, or GAPA. So the interesting thing about GAPA, when we're talking about police reform, is instead of immediately coming out the gate and say, okay, now we want to educate you on what's wrong with the police department, the conversation started with, what does real police accountability look like? In a perfect world, what does public safety look like in your community? And having, starting from scratch, it was difficult because it's hard for people to envision something that they've never had, right? So folks walk in the door and they would say, I don't believe in police accountability because the police have always abused us. So allowing folks some time to really catch their collective breaths and imagine and really push their vision around what they expected and how they wanted to live and working from there, right? So there were real steps, right? Allowing them to actually orchestrate their own liberation, allowing them to say, if we were to create a task force that kept the police accountable, what should they do? What should they look like? Who should be on it? What is your expectation? And then making a commitment to build that with them and giving them an actual seat at the table, fighting alongside them, making sure elected officials listened. I think that that has to be where it starts, right? We find that we're on the constant defense, that we are fighting against systems, and we aren't creating anything that has us in mind. So it was effective, it was moving, it was powerful. We had conversations with folks who said, you know what, we've been here before, right? We've done this before. We've been talking about this since the 70s. We were talking about it before in the 50s, and nothing has happened. So it's difficult to convince people that life can be different. But when you sit down and you work with folks and bring them along and allow them to really manifest what they want their communities to look like, they are a lot more willing to fight for that.
Thank you. And our next question is actually for Jenny. So the roots of your organization is in Albany Park, and I know that you've worked with a lot of different kinds of immigrant communities in that neighborhood. So many immigrants are, especially now, are reticent of political action because they fear that it might jeopardize their immigration status. So I was curious, how do you work to help people overcome that fear, and how can you talk, and also if you could talk about some of the challenges of organizing among different immigrant groups and different ethnic and religious communities who may have arrived in your neighborhood having never had contact with, or even maybe having some biases against the people who are now their neighbors.
Great. Hi everyone, good evening. So maybe I'll start with the second part of the question to lead into the first. So again, Communities United, we started as Albany Park Neighborhood Council as a very neighborhood-based group, and then have grown over the years doing much more city and statewide work, and have renamed ourselves Communities United. And so I think I'll broaden out the question because in the early days, the question was very much about how do we get people in one specific neighborhood living on specific blocks, with 40 languages being spoken, with so many different religions just working together in one community. And that's really grown over time to thinking about how are we really building authentic coalitions and alliances across the city and statewide in a very diverse environment, of course. And so one of the things that we've really been working on, we had really been seeing in our early days of organizing that a lot of the coalition building work and alliance building was really issue-based, right? So a lot of times folks were coming to the table saying we need to, work on public education, justice issues, or we need to work on affordable housing. And there was very little time really devoted to that authentic relationship building and, as Tanya mentioned, around the political analysis. But political analysis not just based, again, on theory, grounded in the lived experiences, right, that we all face as women, as male allies in the community, as young people, as adults. And so one of the things that we felt very early on is that it was critical to create different types of spaces where we were coming together across communities, and that we also knew that racial biases, ethnic biases, religious biases, even among communities of color, were very real and very present as we were beginning to do that work. So it was a big step in organizing. A lot of time folks talk about creating safe spaces, right, where people feel safe to come and share their experiences. For us, it was really about creating safe and brave spaces, right, where people not only feel like it's a comfortable environment where they can express their views, their life experiences, but also have some bravery, right, to challenge and be challenged, especially as we're dealing with issues of race, of trauma, and lived experiences, and things that are very, very personal to folks. So to give a concrete example, one of the early things we did as we were working around a lot of immigration and also criminal justice reform issues was to take a step back from kind of the policy and the kind of campaign organizing, and we brought a group of mothers together, right? And as people began sharing their stories in terms of experiences with family members being deported or mothers who were afraid of being deported and being separated their kids, hearing from formerly incarcerated mothers who had been separated from their children over time, a very different type of transformative experience came out of that led into, I think, a much greater sense of relationship across experience and community, a real belief that we're not just here to win a campaign together, but that we love each other and that we're here to fight for each other and that our struggles are genuinely connected. And so I think that we can all kind of go to trainings on deconstructing biases and do all of those things, which I think are all very important, right, in terms of having framework and analyses to do the work. But for us, it's really been that human connection in a fairly structured environment, right, to make sure that we are not just at the end of the day building relationships, but building power together and building our ability to make change. And we do work a lot with folks who are impacted by the justice system as well as undocumented folks impacted by the deportation part of that system. And a lot of times folks do ask us, aren't people so afraid? And of course people are terrified, especially now. However, we see huge eagerness to get involved and be politically active. And I mean, the question to all of us and our families is, what is the real option? Right? So what is our choice? Is it a choice to really not do anything? So a quick story I'll share is, right, 2 blocks behind where my mother-in-law lives and all of my nieces and nephews live and my daughter spends her day, that was where many of you may have heard about ICE conducting a raid and shooting someone in their home, which to our knowledge is the first time that ICE has ever kind of acted like police in that way in the country that we know of. And so we had a lot of allies who were kind of saying, as we were preparing to do an action around it and do a lot of media work and work to really get to the bottom of what was going on and change how things were happening, a lot of folks said, well, it's just too scary right now for folks to come out. And these were folks who were not undocumented themselves saying that. And we really had to challenge them, right? And folks who had that lived experience themselves, our undocumented leaders, challenge that because, again, it's not like everybody wanted to come out and publicly speak about their experience being undocumented and the injustice, but many did. And so I think a lot of times there are real legitimate issues of fear, and so we have to work through those and work through trusted institutions, develop relationships of trust, show that we follow through. But a lot of the time it's really just trusting people and asking people the right questions and going with their energy. And I think that in this movement and in organizing, it's critically important, as Tanya was saying, you know, sometimes the conversation is about bringing people along. Well, sometimes people, again, don't need to be brought along or told what they should do or shouldn't do or what's too dangerous or what's, you know, not dangerous enough. People just need to be trusted to operate on their instincts for themselves and their family and their community. And I think there's so much momentum and eagerness to get involved right now that even with all of the horrendous things happening, we see no decrease in participation of those most directly impacted. We see increases in involvement.
Great, thank you. So the next question is for Ceci. Oftentimes when grassroots causes are scaled up to legislative action or engagement and partnership with government agencies, political concessions have to be made. And I was wondering if you could talk about how do you grapple with the threat of political co-option and make sure that the work is still reflective and responsive of grassroots needs when you get to a point where your organization is being heard by officials and is being taken seriously by them and you're actually able to influence policy?
Yeah, so thanks. Good evening. So I have to say I came into this work as an organizer many years ago, and so it's so nice to be in a room of organizers because I immediately realized I was doing organizing on the West Side around violence issues back when Paul Vallis thought it was a good idea to send some white kids on the West Side when they were shooting each other. We're like, yeah, no, that's not a good idea. No. Bless his heart. So I started organizing and worked for Daycare Action Council, which then became Illinois Action for Children, and really went out across the state to work with childcare providers and moms of kids in childcare. This was immediately after welfare reform, so the system had just changed. We've moved from AFDC, aid to families with dependent children, to what we now have TANF, temporary assistance to needy families. The whole system had changed. We'd upturned women's lives. And so going out to really organizing and to understand what were the policy priorities as it related to really building self-sufficiency around low-income women. That was the idea. And so we didn't like it. We fought it in the process. We got what we have now. And so really going out there from an organizer's perspective and figuring out what is the next step, right? We lost the policy battle, so to speak, which I wasn't directly involved with, but then came in with an organizing perspective, and because I realized that to create the change in communities that I really wanted to see and be a part of, that we had to connect what was happening in communities, whether it be violence, whether it be, I was working on the West Side, and violence was increasing, and yet resources and funding for violence prevention programs, after-school programs, and violence interrupters was decreasing, and they didn't understand, and so I didn't either. And so having to go upriver and really, kind of go outside of where I felt like I could have the greatest change, which was in the community. And what I realized was I needed to take what was happening in community into the halls that was making policy, right, and deciding where resources flowed. And so I think, so that's kind of what my trajectory. So I come into policy. I don't have a policy degree. I didn't go to policy grad school. I did organizing in Central America as part of my graduate work, but really always coming at it from that perspective, and then learned the policy pieces, right? So one thing I would say is they're learnable. Being a good organizer is kind of who you are. It's your hardwiring, but with a process along the way, but really learning the policy piece is something that you can do and is really critical to help people find their place in that process. So I think the first thing is understanding community and being really respectful of the community and the voice that you're kind of trying to organize, and to to what cause or to what end goal, to be really honest and transparent in terms of you're going to communities, unlike Tanya, they're not my communities, right? I'm going across the state, I'm going to Carbondale, I'm going to Danville, I'm going across the state to really create a statewide policy agenda around moving resources, moving policies that really do support low-income working women. And we do the same thing at EverThrive, Illinois. I'm just 6 months into my job, I should say, around really looking at the services and the supports and the programs that women and children need to thrive. So I think first is really building trust, being transparent about what you're doing, knowing that I have the luxury of this is my full-time job, right? These are women who are working multiple jobs, caring for multiple children, are single-parent households, economically marginalized, and so really knowing that I have to be really respectful of the time of the women that I'm organizing, and I would say that 98% of the families on the Child Care Assistance Program who are relying on child care are women in the state of Illinois, so I can generally say they're women, to be really understand that what is it, how do we best tell their story? How do we help them tell their story? I mean, Jenny talked about power. I think it really is about how do we instill the power in the communities in which we work to make sure that they understand that their story is powerful, that their voice has power, and that they have the ability to create change themselves, right? I mean, Tanya talked about that they are the experts, right? That how do we instill and provide them the avenue and the entry points for where their story matters the most so that they can affect the most change. So really engaging. I think co-option, I have to say, was never really something that I had to worry about. So I became a full-time lobbyist. So I spent about 15 years in Springfield as a full-time lobbyist, and also worked some at the federal level, but primarily in state policy. And partly it was because we built coalitions and we built a membership base. And we really talked about membership base as about building power for advocacy's sake, right? To really making sure that they were part of a larger network and a coalition, because that's where power is, but to make sure that they always had their own voice and that they prioritize their own perspective and their own story and their own lives in that. And then making sure that they had the opportunity to get the tools they needed to be effective advocates, to have their voice heard, and then to operationalize that, right? To say, we're going to train you to be advocates, and then not give them the opportunity to come to Springfield, to go to City Hall, to activate in the streets, to create change. So always making sure that we follow through that process so that we identify the voices and how do we help organize them in the community or help them organize in their communities, and then really walk them through and help them understand what is that civic engagement process. They assume, I remember one of the first families I brought into the Capitol, and they're like, we can just walk in? And I'm like, this is your building. So I think really helping them connect advocacy and change to civic engagement is super critical. I think trust is foundational in terms of not being co-opted. I think understanding that we're never going to get everything we want. And so what is making sure that the coalition has made very clear, here is the line in the sand. Here's what we can sacrifice on. Here's what we can give up. But this is central to our issue, to our movement, to our cause, and to making our lives easier and better. So I think that you have to be very clear that you're all on the same page, because if I walk into a room to negotiate a budget or negotiate a bill and I'm unclear about what that is, then I can't be effective, right? Then I'm either going to sell somebody short, probably myself and the people that I'm trying to represent in a political process. I think that my experience is that the more people are engaged in that process, the hungrier they get. Right, that they might be afraid to enter into something new, but that they embrace it because what they realize is that they're becoming part of the change they want to see. So I think connecting to the political process can be daunting, but I think it's critical in terms of the long-term sustainability about building change in communities from the ground up.
Right. Thank you so much. And the next question is for Anna. Your organization works with women who are working in environments where they might not have access to organized labor unions, and also oftentimes dealing with issues of gender-based violence. So I was wondering if you could talk about how you connect the home and workplace gender violence and who the women are, who you're organizing, And also, how does taking action for workplace rights help them with their struggles at home?
Certainly. Good evening, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I'm extremely happy of being here today for many different reasons, and one of them is because I don't know anybody in the audience, other than a couple of people, which is great. I mean, don't take me wrong. I think that is great because in the over 30 years that I've been doing this activist work, I usually see the same people at every single event that I go. So seeing different faces is really, really refreshing and gives me a lot of hope. I think that some of the compañeras at the table already mentioned that this is a momentum where people everywhere in every single community are really taking a stand on on the issues that have been referred to earlier. So believe me, this is really elating to me. I had prepared some points that I wanted to mention today, but sort of after listening to the powerful messages of the compañeras here, I think that I'm just gonna improvise a little bit. And I'm gonna start by saying that even though I have been presented as an organizer in many occasions in my life, I don't consider myself an organizer. As a matter of fact, I have never in my entire life held a position as an organizer nowhere in any of the organizations that I have worked with, which is kind of interesting because I think that what happened is that the way that I consider myself, coming from the generation that I'm coming from, is more like a militant. I don't know if that makes sense for the majority of you here, but I have always considered myself a militant in a revolutionary global movement against capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy. Therefore, throughout my entire adult life, I have used every single platform that I have to challenge the status quo, right? To really use my position and my privilege as a platform to contest the hegemony of the dominant narrative, which actually pretty much defines the cultural signifiers that we use to explain oppression in our communities. So just to make this a little clearer, I think that one of the reasons why I am presented as an organizer is because we have separated ourselves to some extent from theory and practice, over the last 35 years of the so-called women's liberation movement in this country. And of course, I'm emphasizing the women's liberation movement because this is the topic of our conversation today, women's in the social justice movement. But I think that the struggle that some of us have been facing and the sort of historicity of our struggle is connected to some of the themes that some of the compañeras here have already mentioned. This is a struggle that has been going on for over 500 years. The scariest part is that the same kind of rationale that we have seen coming from the 500s of colonialism is the same that is being used to maintain power and control and oppression over large numbers of people. And why is that? I think that one of the main issues that I can see throughout my life as an activist is that, unfortunately, the kind of analysis and the dominant discourse of our movements, the prevalent analysis hasn't been such that it really includes all forms of oppression as connected to structural issues. For some strange reason, we have gotten at the point, after 35 years of our struggle, of believing that every single woman has a personal choice. And that's what we are promoting over and over and over. And with all due respect for everybody, it seems to me that that's one of the casualties of the dominant liberal feminist narrative. And so when you're thinking about you having a personal choice and agency and so forth, you want to believe that everybody has the same space in their own environments. Guess what? That's not what's happening. And personally, when I joined the feminist movement in my youth back in Mexico, I wasn't necessarily thinking about myself. Because in all honesty, I have a lot of privilege back in my country as a middle-class professional and so forth. So I had a lot of agency and so forth that I didn't know what to do with. It was so much agency. But that wasn't the bottom line. The point was here, who doesn't have that agency in other communities? And that's why I joined the feminist movement and the feminist intersectional movement, because a lot of my sisters didn't have the same kind of privilege that I have. So when I came to this country, I found, surprisingly, that we weren't sharing the same kind of analysis. So I think that has been one of my main struggles here, throughout the entire time in the movement in the States. So my mission, nowadays, responding to the question of the compañera here, is just to go back to the roots of what some of the pioneers of the Black feminists sort of promoted back in 1964. And I'm talking about the Combahee River Collective, which are actually some of the pioneers of Black feminism in the country, which is we all have to work towards a structural intersectionality, which means that in order to dismantle the systems of oppression, we have to work against all these different isms at once. And through my work, what I'm doing is trying to reinvigorate the movement, to reintegrate that kind of analysis in all social justice movements where I can get my hands on, and with the purpose of developing a critical mass movement. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to show a little clip of Dolores Huerta, who will be one of the speakers at the upcoming luncheon, and she's going to share some thoughts about organizing that then we will come back and reflect on. So.
We had to convince people that they have power. They have power. And of course, when you say to a farm worker who doesn't speak the English language, doesn't have formal education, doesn't have any assets, doesn't have any money, that he or she has power, they say, what kind of power do I have? And so what we had to convince the workers is, you do have power, but that power is in your person. That power is in your person. And when you come together with other workers, other people, and they also understand that they have power, this is the way the changes are made. But you can't do it by yourself. You've got to do it with other people. You've got to work together to make it happen. And of course, following Gandhi and Dr. King, and this, you have to change things through nonviolence. Because when we use nonviolence as our philosophy of organizing and of the actions that we take, then other people will come forward to help us. We were in Manhattan, and this farm worker called me. I'm in the office there in New York City, and he calls me and he says, Señora Huerta. And he says this in Spanish, they took the grapes off the store. And so I told him, well, what's the name of the store? And he said, I don't know. I said, well, look at the sign and you can see what the name of the store is. And he said, Señora, I don't know how to read. I don't know how to read. This farmer had gone from Delano, California, all the way to New York City, standing in front of a store asking people, don't come into the store because they're selling grapes. And he got that store to take the grapes off. And it was farm workers like this farm worker that went all over, and eventually something like 14 million Americans stopped eating grapes and got the growers to sit down and negotiate. And this made such a difference because of these workers that understood their power, then we were able to get those growers to give contracts with a medical plan, with a pension plan. Workers could negotiate better wages, getting them rest periods, all of these things that the workers didn't have. That struggle, of course, is not finished, even though the United Farm Workers now is celebrating its 50 years of organizing. We still have farm workers all over the country that still have not won the protections that farm workers in California have, like unemployment insurance, et cetera. So it's still an ongoing struggle. But the thing that we have to remember is that change comes from the bottom, okay? All of the changes that have been made, whether it's the civil rights movement, the peace movement, the women's movement, the LGBT movement, the immigrants' rights movement, the Dreamers have just shown us recently with all of the organizations they have done, that we can make the change, but it's got to start with us. The one thing that we have to always tell people is nobody is going to do this for us. We have to do it for ourselves. Nobody is going to solve our problems. And the one thing that we know is that the people who are suffering the problems are the ones that have the solutions. The people that are going through the suffering and the discrimination, they are the ones that have the answers to how we solve the problems. So the only thing that we need then are the resources for organizing, so that we can share our stories, so that we can show people how to organize. This is what my foundation does.
Dolores was just talking about the importance of convincing people that they have power to take action and influence change. And so the question I'd like to ask all the panelists to respond to is, how do we convince people, especially women and girls in marginalized communities, that they have the power to make change even if the challenges seem unsurmountable? And it would be really great if you could talk about in concrete ways that you can get someone from a point of realizing what the problem is to actually feeling like they can do something about it. And if you have an anecdote to share along those lines, that's also great. So if Tanya, you want to get us started?
So I don't necessarily want to talk about, I'm not going to answer your question the way that you asked it. I'm just going to do what I want to do. I think as organizers, folks who run organizations, also philanthropists, need to really invest in authentically what it means to be a leader, right? So telling someone that they have the power to make changes in their communities, and organizations tokenizing them as leaders and propping them up front and feeding them a narrative is traumatizing, right? And it's wrong. And as organizers, that is what we have historically been trained to do. I think that we need to shift that narrative and that thinking and authentically invest in leaders. I am convinced that, because see, I'm 83 years old, so I can't run this organization forever. And my job as an executive director is to find a dope-ass sister to run this organization behind me, right? It is my responsibility to use all of my time and resources in building women to run for public office, right? So not that you have the authority to go to an elected official to beg them for change. It is my responsibility to make you an elected official, right? So that you can authentically deliver change for your community. People need to be serious about that. They need to be invested in that, and they need to fund it, right? So we have to stop looking at leaders as folks who are there to build our organizations, and really as leaders as folks who we're developing to replace us, right? And to get the authentic wins for their community.
I think first it's kind of helping understand that small wins go a long way, right? So helping people understand that they're not alone, and that helping them have the tools to pull the levers that they need to make the change they want. So that I don't think change happens through any one singular avenue, but I think when I would go around the state working with child care providers and particularly working with parents, when they realized that there were women in Danville that were having the same issues in Peoria, were having the same thing on the west side of Chicago in terms of they couldn't pay their copayment because it was too high, or they made a quarter raise and they suddenly now have to pay $600 a month in childcare, and so they had to quit their job, that they weren't alone, that it wasn't just their unique opportunity, I think helps people understand that it's not something I did wrong. I think that we so demonize and pathologize poor people, people who need services, who need supports, who don't, whatever, that we pathologize that and that we put it on them. And to turn that around and to make sure that they understand, to Anna's point, right, there's a system, right? There is a system in place that is designed inherently to keep poor people poor and to make you poorer sometimes. And so I think that it sounds stupid, but misery love company, right? But I think that there is power to know that if I take action and there's somebody who's doing the same thing in Peoria that's trying to move the same issue forward, I also think that finding that hub of where is your local safe place, to be connected to people across the state, across the country, but to also know that you have that home base, that you know that people have your back and that you can have support. And so for me, I worked primarily with child care providers because that was where people felt safe, because they knew I left my baby there all day. That's a good place for me, right? I talked to them about my kid. They tell me that Sophia bit Saskia at lunch again, or she whatever. And so really finding that common cause that brings people together and then leveraging that to create a power base so that people really do find their voice. One of the most powerful tools we've seen in this country in the last 30 years, last 40 years, particularly for women of color, were Head Start parent councils, right? I have met some of the best organizers and some of the best community leaders, and they came up through Head Start parent councils. Their kids were in Head Start. As part of the war on poverty, they had parent councils because that was a requisite, still is, of Head Start to say that we're going to engage the parents just like we do the kids, right? This is a dual generation strategy, and what you have is women who found their voice, who got the tools, and who had that community, that structure, and that network that built their power base.
I think that I'm going to have to agree with Tanya here, because
I've never been a rule follower. Suddenly,
I think that if we had more time, we could speak at length about the impact of neoliberal policies and neoliberal ideology in the work that we have been doing in both the social service community and also the so-called social justice movements. And I think that one of the big issues that I see in the way that we have been addressing social maladies is, one, we have medicalize the issues or we have criminalized the issues. And the fact that you are all the time speaking about individualization of services, individualization of approaches, once again, you leave the full responsibility to people, and the policies in this country have been helping to some extent. Just think about Mr. Bill Clinton in 1990s and the People or Individual Responsibility Act, and everything that came from there, which meant for our communities of in the Latino community and the African American community, tons of people being incarcerated in big numbers in the 1990s, including women. The amount of women that have been incarcerated since 1990s have been increased exponentially to 839%. So that tells you something about how we've been resolving social issues in this country. So my point is that one of the things that I see as definitely needed is to understand that power is in our numbers. That you're going to find your power by community and collective power. And that is something that history has showed us, and only knowing that kind of history that sometimes we think 200 years ago, but very recent history. I'm coming from a country that has a great example in the Zapatista movement. You cannot think a most marginalized and alienated group in Mexico than the indigenous community. After 500 years of colonization, people there many times have to choose between buying medication for their children or how much they were going to pay for a funeral. And many times I have to go for the latter. That's how sad the situation was in Chiapas. And what happened now is that folks have become an autonomous, self-sustainable community. How did that happen? And that's something that I wish I knew in my early formation as a radical feminist, that you couldn't invest that much, or perhaps the strategy is not investing so much in change only, but also investing in building the kind of society you envision, and if you cannot do it in the entire society as a whole, can you start somewhere? Can you start in a small community? And I think that for me, that's the lesson learned from the Zapatista community. When you see there are no rapes in the Zapatista community, there are no kidnappings, when in Mexico, kidnapping of women happens every day. 6 women in Mexico are femicide every single day. I mean, those are the things that you're not gonna find there. Why? Because they changed institutions? No, because they build Zapatista institutions within the autonomous communities. So, and I think that that is a big lesson learned for me. That yes, you can make change, but you can make change collectively.
And I guess all I would add is I think it's not about convincing people. I think that women are natural organizers and organize all the time. And so similarly to what Tanya said, it's about investing resources. The video, it reminded me of a story that I just told my daughter recently. It was my father-in-law's birthday. He passed away a number of years ago yesterday, so we were telling stories. And one of my favorite stories he used to tell about being a farm worker in Florida picking fruit was that all of the men were constantly amazed because they would get paid based on the weight of the fruit that they picked. And so the men struggled every day in the heat and the bad working conditions. And there was this group of women that they called the killer ladies. And I was like, why are they called the killer ladies? That doesn't sound too good. Yeah. But these women realized, of course, that if they worked together in the fields, right, and picked together and helped each other, that they actually were far exceeding the men in terms of the amount they were able to pick and the profits they were able to get. And they were organizing, right? And so the men were like, oh, we need to learn a thing or two about that, right? And started joining in. So, and even though that wasn't necessarily working towards, broad structural change, it was very, localized collaboration and organizing around the specific, working conditions that they were involved in. I think that it is a lesson that everywhere we look, there are women organizing, and so let's just get the resources, let's work together, let's support each other in the work, and let's, I believe that the more we bring the best of ourselves and the diverse talents and experiences that we have together, that there actually is major change that we can create. And I think that for any of us who have been able to, as Anna mentioned, even at small levels, see some progress or change, it makes getting the taste of change makes you want bigger change and wants you to make you work more broadly. So the more that we can be feeling that and acknowledging it in different ways, that we can't look at change as just a new administration or just a new policy or just a new this, that we have to be holistic in how we think about progress and change so that we can actually feel the hunger and taste and energy that we can actually make a difference.
Great. So we have another clip coming up, but before we roll it, if you have written down a question on a note card, could you please pass it in this direction? Okay, so the next clip is from Alicia Garza, who's also talking about organizing, and similarly, we'll have some reflection afterwards.
Well, nobody listens when you're yelling, Like people tune out, I do. I'm like, oh, they're being really loud right now. I'm gonna come back in when they're a little calmer, So hopefully people are leaning in to try to hear what's going on. And when they lean back out again, hopefully they have some stuff to think about. My name is Alicia Garza, and I'm one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. To say all lives matter in response to Black people saying that Black lives matter, it's actually saying that Black lives don't matter. What's important for you to know is that it's only a threat to you if you believe that Black people should be inferior, if you believe that Black people are living in the conditions that they are because of their own choices and decisions. We are not just a movement that is focused on police violence and police brutality. The reality is that for Black people in this country, we have been plagued by a pervasive and dominant system when we look at issues of housing, employment, education, healthcare and healthcare access, Black people are at the bottom of those disparities. Over the last 3 years, we've grown from a hashtag to an international organizing network. Lots of people think that organizing is being in the streets with a bullhorn and turning up. And organizing is not really that at all. None of organizing is glamorous, but some of it is rewarding. We can build a world where all lives matter together if we acknowledge the ways today in which all lives don't matter.
The question I'd like to ask in context of this video is, Alicia talks about the difference between people's perception of organizing and the reality of organizing. So I'm wondering, what is something that you wish you had known about community organizing or political mobilization work when you first started out, or would want someone interested in organizing their community to know about? Like, what's something you wish you had known early on that you know now? So, if you want to kick it off again, Tanya.
Sure. On the end. What I know now that I wish I would have known sooner is that within organizing, isms exist, right? You walk in spaces, even the most, I came into this, so like, these are my people. And I quickly found out that that ain't necessarily the case, right? That there is racism in organizing. There is sexism in organizing. There is misogyny in organizing. Folks who have this very progressive narrative don't always check themselves, right? Check their own privileges, right? And I spent a lot of years allowing myself to be a token, transparently. And what I would have told Tanya years ago is that you have permission in every space to call that shit out, right? You're not in organizing for the comfort of other people, right? Even folks who you believe are fighting for the same issues as you. It is okay to say in this space, not only do I feel marginalized, I will not have it, right? It has not been easy as a Black female executive director in Chicago, right? I have had to own the fact that I am absolutely a bitch, right? And I don't want you to forget that when I leave the room, right? Because if that's what you have to label me in order for you to accept my power, then that's on you and not me, right? So, I want those leaders turn activists, turn organizers to be empowered to challenge the systems that exist amongst their allies and be fully okay with that. This is not about being comfortable, right? This is about creating discomfort for progress.
Thanks. Ceci?
I think for me, it would be really thinking about the multiple levers, right? That it's a little bit like the intersectionality, that you can't just do one thing at a time and think that you're gonna create change or help. And so for me as an organizer, that I wish I had learned more about the messaging pieces and the coalition building and what does that really look like and how do you do that effectively, that you can't just want it bad enough and you can't have that, you're driven by the passion and your vision for change, but I think there are skills and tools that you need to build along the way that I think we're getting better with it, maybe, in terms of thinking about the next generation of organizers that are coming up. But I don't think that we paid any attention when I was coming up in organizing around that skill set, right? It was just you have the passion and you're willing to sacrifice and that's all you needed and go forth. And I think that that's not true. I think that there is more of, not necessarily be driven purely by a theoretical and philosophical approach. I think that there is value in that, but I think there are just practical skills that I never that nobody ever took the time to teach me or even tell me, go out and find somebody to teach you these things, because they really do matter, right? Because if at the end of the day what you're doing is to create change, it's not always going to happen the same way, and you're not going to be able to plan and predict it. And so make sure that you have multiple things in your toolbox so that you can think about strategic messaging. You can really meet people where they are, right? You're not going to have the luxury of spending your whole life singing to the choir. The idea is to move people out of their comfort zone and move them to closer to where you want them to be. And so you have to be able to have the skills and the strategies to be able to meet people where they are, and then to figure out how hard and how fast can you push. The other piece is, you know, and it took me a long time to get there, was if what I was doing in communities wasn't in some way, shape, or form intentionally connected to a policy change process, then I was always going to be limited in my impact. And if, again, if what I was doing was for impact, then I needed to be intentional, whether it would be me individually, the coalition that we were building, the community, whatever, it needed to be connected to a policy change, whether that be the local school council, whether that be the city of Chicago, whether that be whatever, you know, kind of institutional system or structure. But if that's the one that, if that's the root cause in terms of why we're fighting the fight that we're fighting, then we have to figure out what's our entry point into that, because we have to infiltrate it. And so to be really clear about that.
Great. Anna?
You know, I think that what I would definitely had appreciated to learn earlier in my life as a militant was that changing the objective conditions of people's lives, I mean, changing the socioeconomic conditions of people's lives, was as important as changing the cultural values, and meaning the cultural signifiers on people's minds. And what I mean by that is that changing the structural conditions is not enough if you don't know if you don't change people's minds and people's belief systems. And I would have liked to see my work emphasizing the need for changing the value of accumulation of capital over claiming the full humanity of every single person in society, or changing the importance of money towards people, or changing the idea of big egos in our community, among our community of organizers, versus care and solidarity. So all those things, perhaps I could have learned earlier if I had really listened to one big revolutionary who I admired a lot, Ernesto Che Guevara, said at some point in his life, and he said, the true revolutionary is guided by real feelings of love. And that was something that it was a little difficult for me to really internalize, because I don't love everybody, you know, certainly, and it's really hard to do it, and I try, but believe me, it's impossible sometimes. But I think that what Che was saying there is that you have to find what is the fuel to move you forward. And I think that for many of us in the old school kind of radical left, we were always pretty angry. And I think for a good reason, because it's impossible not to be angry when you see the conditions of dispossession the majority of communities live at, you know? The precarious work that you have to do, the kind of violence that you endure, whether it's interpersonal or systemic, you know, so you have to be angry. There's nothing wrong with being angry, but I think that that cannot be the only fuel, and I think that Jenny already spoke about love. You know, and that for some of us sometimes is a little difficult to grasp, because sometimes it means that we are going to be holding and kissing everybody, but not necessarily. You know, it means to really retune your life purpose. You know, and what that means, what it means to really build, and I have been talking about building and building the entire night, building a beloved community. You know, and I think that that's what I aspired to build. Or to contribute to building nowadays. And I really wish I had learned that earlier in my life. A lot of people that I fought with would be very appreciative of that.
And Jenny?
So I agree with what was said, and I guess the only thing I would add is earlier before this event, we were talking with Alicia a little bit about sustaining ourselves in this work over time, and I think as I was thinking about that question, there's only actually been one time when I actually thought, oh my gosh, I'm not cut out for this, I need to leave, and that was after being through a 10-day organizer training. And I left so depressed and feeling like, this was just not for me. And I think that there was a really big lesson in there for me about this notion of even being trained in this work. And going back to what Tanya said, is almost being viewed as a product, right? That someone else trying to mold you into something very specific for a specific purpose that they've already kind of envisioned, and that feeling very inauthentic and not at all what I was interested in. So I think that for me, the major lesson out of that and what's sustained me in the work is really just having the confidence, right, to stick to a creative spirit. I think myself and others on the panel and in this field, are willing to learn from and with all types of folks from all different backgrounds, right? But then if it ever becomes about prescribing to a model, right, and just being indoctrinated to that, it becomes not authentic and not grounded and not really about building from the ground up. So I think that was a lesson over time in the Chicago kind of culture of organizing that I entered into years ago that actually wasn't very well received at all to kind of not be as prescriptive in a model. And it was very heavily rejected by many. So I think that just having that confidence in being creative in the work and sticking to that is a big lesson.
Great, thanks. So I think we've got some audience questions now. Great, thank you. Okay. Oh, great. These are numbered. All right. So if most of these seem general, so maybe if the spirit moves you once you hear it and you want to jump with a response, we'll do it that way. Okay, so the first question is, how do you reach out to unlikely allies, groups that might not on the surface be obvious supporters, but would bring new perspectives, energy, and resources? For example, sympathetic business owners on workers' rights.
I mean, I would say there's always shared space, right? So what is it, to be honest, that we're not going to agree on everything, but where do we agree? So, right, so workers' rights is, the employer perspective might be about reducing turnover, or how do I make sure that I keep a quality staff? So to me, there's always, unusual allies are really key to a successful campaign if you're trying to move people's opinion or move public opinion, but you're never going to agree on everything. But just owning that and figuring out, is there something that we can agree on that moves both of our agendas forward? And to be really transparent and honest about that, and figuring out, okay, this is the stuff we can do together, but know that we might be on opposite sides over here. And I've had plenty of examples of that in terms of moving state policy, and if you're honest and you're upfront and you understand that there's mutual beneficiality, then I think you can always find something. But sometimes you can't, and then you got to walk away.
That unfortunately my experience speaks to the fact that it's very difficult to find a middle ground with corporations that are in the business of making money over the backs of working class people. So I think that sometimes when corporations are willing to negotiate with workers, it's because there is a lot of work that has been more coming from the bottom up that force them to be at the table. I mean, it's not like a very gracious concession, that comes from somebody good heart. I think that the only problem, the problem that you find here is you have to contest power with power, and that's something that you can never forget. So in order to bring people to the table to make those kind of negotiations, you have to first and foremost have a base. Yeah, so you can be in some kind of equal terms at the table. You know, I unfortunately, once again, this is my experience working in different parts of the world, not only in the United States, but it's very difficult to get, just like I said, a gracious concession from capitalists. You know, I mean, just their principles are completely opposed to what we are trying to do. You know, so, yeah.
Did you also want to add something, Tanya?
Sure. And I think it's important to really stick to your narrative, right? You know, no matter what space that you're in, you know, we're organizing around the police union contracts, and really bringing to the surface that labor contracts are there to protect labor, but not murderers, right? And it's been a very difficult line to walk where you don't seem anti-union, right? But being very surprised, my organizing, even though she's younger than me, but I call her my organizing big sister. Her name is Caitlin Johnson. She's in the audience. She's the executive director of Action Now. She's kind of one of the people who've held my hand throughout this process of community organizing. And we're also partners in an organization called the Black Roots Alliance. But ironically enough, there have been other unions who have come forward and reached out to Caitlin and said, you know what, we want to get in on this fight around police union contracts, which was absolutely surprising and completely unlikely. But they understood that their members were actually directly impacted folks, right? And so in order to protect their union members, it was important for them to get engaged in this conversation. So when we talk about, you know, police accountability and police contracts, when we talk about minimum wages, right? And we have corporations and business owners and people that understand that they actually depend on workers to keep their business going, not only as the people who fuel their business, but the folks who like buy shit, right? So it makes obvious sense that they make living wages in all communities. So, you know, really keeping that narrative where it's not, you know, as we talked about, it's not coming from a place of, you know, you're not organizing around the fact that we hate, right, folks, that we are organizing from a place of love, from a place of protection. And I think that, you know, who doesn't want to protect working families, right? Who thinks that it's okay to like murder folks on the street? So I think that that's something that any sensible person should be able to get behind, and they join us in this fight naturally.
Great. So unless you have any objections, we can move to the next question. So this is from the same person. What's been your experience, if any, with trying to build a coalition with people or organizations who have platforms, some of which you might really disagree with? Some elements of the platform, I guess.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, what has been your experience, if any, with trying to build a coalition with people or organizations who have platforms, some of which you might really disagree with? So I think what this is getting at is that sometimes a big organization might have a platform, a political organizing platform that has many different points, and what do you do if some of those things you really disagree with?
Well, I guess from my perspective, if there's an organization with a platform that goes actually against our values that we stand for, we actually wouldn't build a coalition or alliance with that organization. It doesn't mean we wouldn't be necessarily in relationship with them and trying to talk through the different issues, maybe build some greater relationship and understanding. But what we find is that you have to have shared values at the root of it in order to be able to move anything forward. And I think that was, that's present in a lot of the work. I think that, for example, for Communities United, we work with, for example, a lot of faith institutions from multiple different backgrounds. And in terms of our work around LGBTQ rights over the years, we found We'll need to re-examine the way that we were working with and partnering with faith institutions who, in the end, really backed away from our organization because of specific stances that we were taking. So I think that sometimes we learn the hard way, sometimes we learn the easy way, but I think there's absolutely no way to get around having shared values on the front end, as you're at the same time not shutting the door to other relationships and working to build folks. We've seen over the years huge progress through relationship building and the sharing of lived experience and through organizing and actually moving folks along to be much more rooted in our shared values. And to be open and accepting of folks of different identities, and to be actually fighting for and with folks of different backgrounds and identities. But that takes work and time and investment. So we really start with, again, a core in our alliances and coalitions of value-based organizing.
Yeah, and I would just say that not all change happens through coalitions, right? There are moments in time. There might be an issue specific, and so I think there's kind of those targeted partnerships, and then there's that, who is your core, who's your foundation in terms of your long-lasting coalition. So I think we. For my experience, not everything is going to happen in a coalition, right? You might have a couple of targeted partners because you have a short-term goal in mind, but that the kind of foundational coalition is about shared values. But then, to your point, you can always find places to work together with different people. I think there's multiple kind of levels of those relationships in order to get something, to accomplish a goal.
Great. So the next question is pretty interesting. How do you address the issue of hierarchical activism? So, for example, when folks presume that artistic content or dialogue are more or less significant or necessary than, say, community organizing or policy work. So, how do you address the issue that some types of work that's part of your organization's efforts is maybe perceived as more or less necessary? I mean, I'm going to take the liberty to interpret the question a little more. I think that in some organizing spaces, this is just what I've observed as a reporter as well, there seems to be like a presumption that like certain type of like care work, for example, will be done by women and is less central and important than like the door knocking and the canvassing and the like maybe lobbying of politicians, but like somebody brings the food, somebody does the like art for the posters, and so I think that this is what this is getting at. Like how do you manage, or maybe is this not really an issue in your organizing spaces?
So I can't say that it has necessarily been an issue within our organization, but it's been an issue in the activist community, right? And I don't know if I'm going to address so whoever asked this, I'm sorry if I'm going to say like something else. So I want to apologize ahead of time. But there are real conversations about, what is necessary to build poor communities of color, right? Is it, practicing group economics? Is it, social justice organizing? Is it, specifically just politics? And really, listening and agreeing with folks, because it's all of those things. Like, I think that's like, for me, the obvious answer. So when folks say, you won't get anywhere by protesting, you need to do this. But, what if we hit these issues from every possible angle, right? What if we took, your strengths, your talents, and your interests and grew them and allowed you to do that thing while I'm over here protesting, banging down doors, and, holding elected officials accountable? So really valuing what people bring to the table and convincing folks that it really is going to take all that to really have like some real wins and some real progression.
I think that my experience working in the, specifically the violence against women movement, which actually is not a movement, but rather a sector or a field. And as I would argue that just because it doesn't meet the criteria of what a political movement is, and I think that that's one of precisely the points that I wanted to make. You know, when you have organizations that are hierarchically structured, where the people in the community, so-called survivors of gender violence, are clients whose voices are really not integrated into the general agendas for policy advocacy strategies, and they are absent from the table, et cetera, and just the fact that I am saying us and them, I mean, it's very problematic. Unfortunately, that is not what the movement was about back in the 60s or 70s, where women started this political movement with a motto, you know, that I actually still like a lot, that was the personal is political. You know, so meaning that every single person that was part of this movement was actually actively involved in a very non-hierarchical way, you know, and my recollection of my reading, because unfortunately I wasn't part of the movement on the 60s or 70s, but my recollection of my readings and talking to some of the veterans of the movement, people started the movement in kitchen tables and coffee shops, where there was no such a hierarchy. Unfortunately, the field became now highly professionalized with each other thing that I suppose is being shared also with the organizing, for instance, in the workers' rights movement, you know, when you have the professional organizers versus the new cadre that you are working with in the community. And I think that that's a big tension, you know, in every single sector, but I see less of a tension in the workers or the labor rights community, and more like the grassroots groups that are popping up, and they are so-called alternative groups of alternative institutions in our communities. And they are called alternative because they don't have funding from the usual players, or they don't have funding at all. You know, it's people that do more like in Spanish is called grupos autogestivos or proyectos autogestivos. That means like community-driven projects where you're not going to see this kind of hierarchy at all. So I think that this is something that perversely kind of dominated what the anti-violence against women movement was and became completely a field and a sector. You know, and I am not saying that what the social service community is doing is not important. It's extremely relevant, totally relevant. But I think that when the movement started, it was an idea of maintaining some kind of harm reduction through services provided to the community, but also a political movement along with it. And that, for some reason, disappeared. So I think, and now one of the questions that I pose to my peers in the field over and over is like, how are we integrating community into our everyday work and also into the political advocacy agendas that we are taking? So, and that's something that I still don't receive any answer from, you know, because unfortunately the compañeras that are suffering all sorts of violence in the community are clients that cannot be in equal terms with the professionals in the organization. So I think that that's a big discussion that is still going on in many places. And it hasn't been really addressed seriously.
And I would just add that I think that where I see kind of the discussions around hierarchy of different approaches playing out most is really not from kind of the grassroots. It's around organizations competing for resources. And that's when this kind of prioritization, this eagerness to create rigid definitions, this, again, hierarchy of what's most important, I think comes out in kind of its ugliest forms. And that if we're talking about social movement, there's a role for everyone and all different approaches, and we're all whole people. And if anything, do I want my life to be absent from art if I'm organizing around policy? No, right? All of these things are connected. So I think it's just something that we as organizers in our personal life and then, you know, in our professional life too, always have to be conscious of is how we're not helping to feed more destructive cycles.
Yeah, and actually, there's a question here specifically about that, so I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. The person is asking, how do national organizations such as Emily's List or Galvanize impact local opportunities for coalition building or resource acquisition or change making? So if anyone has any more thoughts about that, about how do you work in a context where there's also big kind of professional groups or national organizations that are coming in and also competing for the same local resources?
I think for me, because I think everybody struggles with this, is, there's value, there's benefit from being big and well-known, and there's also benefit in being small and still on the ground and having that nimbleness and that capacity. And so I think, we definitely partner with some national organizations that, they don't have to spend 3 minutes explaining what they do because their name is their brand, right? And they're kind of accessible to everybody because they've been around and they've done good work. But I think that there's always room for partnership there and to figuring out what that is and to not be immediately, sometimes we can be our worst enemies, right? And assuming that because we're in the same space that we have to compete, but that where is the opportunity for, like, here's the role you play in this, but here's what I can play because I'm small, I'm nimble, I have a direct constituency or whatever it is. So I think that the first response is always that we have to compete. But I think if you step back, there's almost always room for collaboration, and sometimes there's resources connected in those collaborations. Not always, but sometimes. And so, because I think what to dichotomize left and right, I think what the right relies on is for us to kind of decapitate ourselves, right, or each other, and then so they just stand by and watch, and they didn't have to do anything. And so I think we have to be really careful about what is the possibility for collaboration when it doesn't naturally present itself.
2 points to make. The first one is that, once again, I'm going to say that my experience working in the Global South or sort of being a militant in the Global South is very different from what happens in the Northern Hemisphere. So every time that I go back to, let's say, my own native country, Mexico, or to Guatemala, or to South Africa, where I go rather frequently, people are very surprised that we talk about funding or being subsidized to contest the policies of the system. It's like really odd. Because, if you think about it, you are contesting the forces that keep you oppressed. How is it that the people that maintain the status quo and the establishment is going to be giving you money to contest their own position and role in society? It's a little bit crazy if you think about it. So, of course, people there just don't understand what I am talking about. Yes, I am militant against, like I said earlier, all these structural issues, and I'm looking for funding. So it's crazy in their head. It's like they cannot grasp this idea. But this is a United States, and it's completely like very sui generis space, in many ways. So the thing is, like, how can we explain what is going on right now, and the fact that some of our organizations, being very progressive minded, are being funded right now? And I think that, the political landscape is changing, and this is what happened when you are facing such a huge backlash. We are really facing really a backlash, a political, social, and economic backlash. And we see how the rising of the most retrograde groups in this country, but at the same time, there is a response. That's how history operates. So there is a huge response of progressive forces of progressive people everywhere. So here we are, but there are also responses from some more progressive philanthropic institutions. And I can just mention a few, like the one that actually gave me this fellowship a couple of years ago, NOVO, N-O-V-O Foundation, which is a huge national foundation that has megabucks and is trying to be more mindful about the kind of sort of practices at a community level that are not getting any funding from nowhere, because they seem to be very difficult to account for, because everybody wants numbers and results and outcomes, and how you are going to be presenting outcomes of processes. It's very difficult to say what I'm doing is building community. Okay, yeah, show me how and give me your numbers. So these kind of people in the philanthropic world, like Novo and other foundations that are changing the way that they have been categorizing or qualifying the different organizations that are applying for funding. And I'm not going to be making commercials about any other foundation in Chicago, because that's not my role. But I can tell you that you can look for some of those foundations right now that they are creating new categories to fund movement building or community accountability, or community organizing, which was unheard of. So I think that things are shaping, and they are not changing just because, once again, out of the gracious decision of some people. I think that in social theory, you're always going to see that synergy is created at the bottom. We have created, the movement have created that need, even among the philanthropy world, to shift a little bit their ways. We need each other. I mean, the whole idea of the butterfly reaction and whatnot is true. So this kind of synergy in the most progressive communities has impacted the work that some of those foundations are conducting. So I think that we are on a good place right now, and you guys are talking about collaboration, and my experience is that the mantra nowadays is collaboration. So, and also the possibility of some groups right now, alternative groups, so community groups, to really get a little bit of support or a jump start. Anyway.
Thanks. So I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us.